Welcome to episode 11 and the final episode in this season of 17th Century Tales. East Midlands Civil War stories with a cavalier preference, brought to you from a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. Episode number 11, One Town, Four Governors, Part 2. The one town is Newark, and the four governors are John Henderson, Richard Byron, Richard Willis, and John Bellasyse. We covered John Henderson and Richard Byron last week. This week it's the turn of the two final governors who protected Newark from the Roundheads during the First Civil War. In last week's episode, the lives of John Henderson and Richard Byron were distinct and separate from each other, united by the fact that they both did the same job. So their stories were easier to tell in a linear fashion. But that's not the case with this week's episode. The lives of Richard Willis and John Bellasyse intermingle and connect. And they both play significant parts in each other's stories, largely because they hated each other's guts. So I'll do my best to tell the stories in a separate and distinct fashion, but their stories will intermingle. So let's not waste any more time and tell the story of the third governor of Newark, Richard Willis. But just a little reminder as to what a governor was. A governor was a military more than a political position, and a governor was the military leader of a town or a city. So it helped enormously if the military governor in question had a degree of experience fighting. Now, this could either be accrued on the battlefields of the Civil War itself, like Willis's predecessor, Richard Byron, had accomplished, or it might have been gained fighting in the wars on the continent before the Civil War, like John Henderson, the first governor of Newark. In that regard, Richard Willis resembled John Henderson. He had been a soldier of fortune fighting in the 30 Years' War. He had participated in the Siege of Breda, fighting for the Dutch. But he had become a soldier of fortune because his prospects in England were quite meagre. Compared to other landed gentry, he wasn't that wealthy, and he wasn't the eldest son, and he didn't stand to make a lot of money when his parents popped their clogs. He went to university. He studied at Christ's College, Cambridge, but then sort of abandoned any academic pursuits to go off abroad and become a soldier. After his stint in Europe, he came back in time to participate in the wars with the Scots that preceded the Civil Wars that we know as the Bishops' Wars. So in 1642, by the time the Civil War started, he was yet another experienced soldier who pledged his loyalty to the king. He seemed to be a gifted cavalryman and won a knighthood for his conduct in a skirmish in Shrewsbury in October 1642. In December that year, he was taken prisoner when Winchester fell to the Roundheads, but then he escaped and came back to serve the king. In 1643, he was promoted to Major General, and then in 1644, during a raid on Ellesmere, he was captured again and put in the Tower of London this time for 9 months. He was released in a prisoner exchange and then threw in his lot with constant regular in these podcasts, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's nephew and his best soldier on horseback. And it would be his association with Prince Rupert that would facilitate his downfall and initiate a long and destructive feud with the next governor of Newark, John Bellasyse. But we'll get to that in good time. In May 1645, Sir Richard Willis was made governor of Newark, replacing Sir Richard Byron. Now, it's interesting to note that Sir Richard Willis was the only governor of Newark of the four governors that we cover in these two episodes that never suffered a siege. There were 3 sieges, there were 4 governors. His governorship happens in between the second and third sieges. And he missed participating in the third and final siege of Newark by a cat's whisker. And the reason was because of his association with Prince Rupert. Now, up until the Second Siege of Newark in 1644, Rupert had militarily done very little wrong. He'd gone from victory to victory, with the occasional draw thrown in which Rupert would still somehow distinguish himself. But immediately after the Siege of Newark, Rupert's halo started to slip. Immediately after the Siege of Newark, arguably Rupert's greatest military achievement on English soil, came the Battle of Marston Moor and a catastrophic defeat. So Richard Willis was made governor of Newark in May 1645. In early June, Prince Rupert and the king suffered their worst military defeat at the battlefields of Naseby. After Naseby, Rupert was forced to surrender Bristol, the last remaining port available to the Cavaliers. The surrender of Bristol triggered a massive falling out between Rupert and the king, exacerbated, fueled and facilitated by a rival of Prince Rupert's, Lord Digby, who had the king's ear and confidence at that point in the war. Now, the details of this feud and fallout have been covered extensively in part 2 of the Fighting Prince episode of this podcast. But the reason I'm telling you this again is because Richard Willis was caught up directly in the fallout of this feud between the king and his nephew. In fact, Richard Willis was entertaining the king at the time. The king was in Newark. And Newark's significance had been largely amplified by the fact that the Cavaliers were losing the war. In fact, they'd lost the war, but certain towns carried on fighting because that was what the king willed. And Newark was arguably one of the sturdiest and most well-defended garrisons still holding out against the Roundheads, and would have been considered a secure destination for the king to reside in. It was also a chaotic and cacophonous place to govern if you were Richard Willis. And the reason for this was that if you was a cavalier that still wanted to fight, then Newark was an obvious destination to make for, to either participate in one glorious last stand, or to launch attacks against the surrounding Roundhead countryside, praying for a miracle that your divinely appointed monarch was surely entitled to. Consequently, there were over 20 generals in Newark when the king was present, and too many generals had the ironic, paradoxical consequence of producing very little discipline amongst the soldiers under their respective commands. And so there was a lot of drunkenness in Newark and a breakdown in order. One of the reasons that the king was in Newark in the first place was to get away from Rupert, whom he had placed under house arrest in Oxford and had ordered out of the country because he had surrendered Bristol. And the king had been convinced by his advisor, Lord Digby, who, as you remember from a few moments ago, was a sworn enemy of Rupert, that Rupert had surrendered Bristol as an act of cowardice and treachery. Rupert had busted out of Oxford and was on his way to Newark, fighting his way across the East Midlands with a retinue of 120 armed and loyal men in search of a reckoning with his uncle. Now, Richard Willis was friends with Rupert. He'd fought with Rupert. He had a lot of personal loyalty to Rupert. And so when it was reported that Rupert was approaching Newark, Richard Willis and a fellow friend and ally of Rupert's, Sir Charles Gerard, rode out to meet him. This was not a diplomatic thing to do, as they were publicly showing their fealty to someone that the king had publicly denounced as a traitor. No sooner had Prince Rupert entered Newark, he marched into where the king was staying, the governor's house, also known as Greg's. Yes, it's a Greg's. The building's still there today, and it is a Greg's. Oh, it's been so many episodes since I've said Greg's, and I'm going to say it one more time. Greg's. Greg's, that's 3 times. And I think I should be awarded points for my self-control in doing an entire episode last time about the governors of Newark and not mentioning Greg's once. Well, I'm just going to mention it one more time. Greg's. Where was I? Yes. Prince Rupert walked into the governor's house and had an argument with the king and demanded to be put on trial. The king consented, and interestingly, on the panel of military judges was Sir Richard Byron himself. Not that the trial was rigged. There were people less sympathetic to Rupert on the panel of the court-martial, and all of them, all 7 judges, unanimously found him not guilty of cowardice and treason. Now, there was nothing the king could do to punish Prince Rupert, but the king almost immediately sacked Sir Richard Willis as governor of Newark, largely for his impertinence in going out to greet Prince Rupert. I think those were the official reasons. But in reality, if he couldn't get Rupert, he would get one of his friends, making Sir Richard Willis collateral damage in a fallout between the king and his nephew. And to add insult to injury, the king replaced Richard Willis with John Bellasyse, a very good friend of Lord Digby's, the enemy of Rupert, an originator of this feud in the first place. Now Rupert, who could be very honourable to those who were loyal to him, took this very personally, and it provoked a second argument with the king. And Prince Rupert interrupted his uncle the king while he was eating for a second time in Greggs. Rupert didn't interrupt the king on his own. He brought 20 men with him, and among the 20 men was Gerard and Richard Willis. And the king happens to be dining with John Bellasyse, the man that's replaced Richard Willis. Richard Willis, showing very little decorum or respect in the presence of the king, and demands justice from his monarch. He's supported in this by Prince Rupert, who is convinced that all of this has happened because of his dispute with the king. Then Gerard gets involved and starts slagging off Digby as being the originator of all of this nonsense. And then people start drawing swords and it all gets a little bit scary. And at some point in all this cacophony, Richard Willis challenges Lord John Bellasyse to a duel. Now the king, who's been relatively quiet while all of this has been sort of going on around him, finally exerts his authority, shuts everybody up, and then actually offers to hear Richard Willis's case in private. But Richard Willis is having none of it. He wants to be publicly exonerated, put on trial and vindicated like Prince Rupert was. Well, this is the last straw for the king, who loses his temper and orders everybody out. Even Prince Rupert in the fallout realises that they've all probably overstepped the mark a little bit and drafts a letter of apology. There's a sort of tentative make-up between Rupert and the king. And then Rupert leaves Newark with 400 men. Remember, he turned up with 120, but such was, I imagine, the level of sympathy for Rupert's position that he manages to pilfer 280 extra soldiers from the garrison of Newark as he leaves. Needless to say, Gerard and Sir Richard Willis go with him. Prince Rupert knew that the war could not be won, and he drafts a letter to Parliament essentially asking for permission to leave the country. In the letter, he extends that request for permission to Gerard and Willis, protecting his maligned and abused officers from the repercussions of Roundhead retaliation after the war. The fallout with the king happened in October 1645, and the war would continue until June 1646 with the surrender of Oxford. Richard Willis was present at Oxford and was one of the Cavalier officers who officially handed the city over to the Roundheads as part of the official surrender. And then, taking advantage of the safe passage negotiated by his patron, he got out of England and went to live in Italy. Before he went to Italy, he'd patched up his relations with the king, and the king had pardoned him and had actually rewarded him, largely for his exemplary service up to his sacking at Newark, with a baronet. June 1646, Sir Richard Willis was made Baronet of Fen Ditton. But that's not the end of Richard Willis's story. Oh no, it's about to become even more interesting and riddled with intrigue and infighting. That's a lot of ins. In the year 1652, after the king had been executed and after Charles II's failed attempt to reinvade the country and claim his throne that we call the Third Civil War, Richard Willis came back to England and joined an organisation called the Sealed Knot. Now, the name the Sealed Knot will be familiar to many people as the name of a very famous Civil War reenactor society. But the society takes its name from a secret organisation of royalists resident in England, appointed by the king in exile, Charles II, whose job it was to look out for signs for, organise, and initiate rebellion. There were 6 leaders of the Sealed Knot, and amongst them was Willis and his old enemy, John Bellasyse. Now, the Sealed Knot weren't the only underground royalist movement in England. There were others. There were the Swordsmen, Prince Rupert's faction. And then there was a group that called themselves the Action Part. Now, the difference between the Swordsmen, the Sealed Knot, and the Action Part was that the Sealed Knot was the more, how can I put this, measured and sensible and less prone to violence of the 3 organisations, and they had their rules about how to conduct a sensible rebellion. The most important rule was that it was to be a purely royalist rebellion, conducted without recourse to relying on foreign allies, or worse still, Presbyterian Scots. The second rule was patience. The Sealed Knot were committed to biding their time and waiting for such time as the parliamentarians fell out amongst themselves, and that they would launch their rebellion when their enemies were at their most divided. Now, the 2 men who seemed to be closest to Prince Rupert during the Newark debacle, Sir Charles Gerard and Sir Richard Willis, neither man was part of the Swordsmen, which were Prince Rupert's faction. Sir Richard Willis was with the more moderate Sealed Knot, and Sir Charles Gerard had managed to talk his cousin John Gerard into organising an assassination attempt on Oliver Cromwell that would come to be known as the Gerard plot, and would go udders up very quickly and result in Gerard getting his head chopped off and Sir Richard Willis being arrested as a suspected co-conspirator. Sir Richard Willis was almost certainly nothing to do with the Gerard plot, and Willis appears to have been set free. Sir Richard Willis detected the hand of Lord Bellasyse in his misfortune and believed with all his heart that his old Cavalier enemy had sold him out to the Roundheads. In 1655 there was another rebellion in the west of England, a royalist rebellion called Penruddock's Rising. The Sealed Knot had a hand in delaying the rebellion, as was their policy of waiting until the time was right. Well, as far as the Penruddock Rising was concerned, the timing was wrong and the rebellion was quashed, and the Sealed Knot were held responsible by many Cavaliers for the failure of the rebellion. And so the stock of the Sealed Knot started to plummet as far as the confidence of the king was concerned. Now, around about 1656, Richard Willis was in conversation with John Thurlow, the spy master of Oliver Cromwell, who was clearly trying to recruit Richard Willis as a double agent. And Richard Willis seemed to go along with it. And no one's completely sure why, what his motives were, because he didn't really betray anybody, or at least there's no evidence that he did. Possible motives are that he was strapped for cash and was trying to play the system, get a bit of money, but not really give away any incriminating information. Another motive was that he wanted to avoid potential pointless bloodshed brought on by badly planned royalist rebellions that were doomed to failure. In his own way, a kind of odd, inverted act of patriotism. He was said to have negotiated a deal with Thurlow that if he gave him information, it could not result in harm coming to any royalist. In 1658, Sir Richard Willis managed to simultaneously protect the royalist cause and betray the royalist cause. An emissary of the king, the Marquis of Ormond, had arrived in London under the noses of the Roundheads. That is until Richard Willis told them about it. But having told them about it, he refuses to give away the address of where Ormond is staying, and then tips off Ormond that Thurlow's men are looking for him. The royalists in exile are none the wiser, and all this time Richard Willis is writing to Sir Edward Hyde, one of Charles II's chief advisors. And Richard Willis is writing under the assumed name of Thomas Brockwell. Well, Richard Willis does his dance with John Thurlow for about 3 years. And then Richard Willis is betrayed to the Cavaliers by John Thurlow's secretary, a man called Samuel Mortland, who was considering a bit of treachery of his own and was planning to leave the parliamentarians and join the royalists. There was a little bit of umming and ahhing at court as to whether to believe these accusations against their trusted servant, Richard Willis. They eventually decided that they did believe them. In 1660, when King Charles II was restored to the throne of England, Sir Richard Willis was dealt with. Like everything in Richard Willis's life, it wasn't straightforward what happened. On the one hand, he was declared a traitor and sentenced to death, but he wasn't put to death. In fact, he was given a pardon. But it was a conditional pardon, the condition being that he must never come anywhere near the king or his inner circle for the rest of his life. But why not kill him? Possibly because his information genuinely never did lead to anybody losing their life or being harmed in any significant way. Possibly also his life was spared because of his exemplary service during the Civil Wars. In a way, Richard Willis had the last laugh because he got married to a very rich lady and live out the rest of his life. He would eventually die in 1690 in the luxury that had eluded him as a loyal servant of the crown. But in a way, he didn't have the last laugh because, rightly or wrongly, he would be perceived as a traitor until the day he died. And many still think of him as a traitor today. Now let's talk about his enemy, Lord John Bellasyse, the fourth and last governor of Newark during the First Civil War. Lord John Bellasyse was a Yorkshireman and a Catholic. He was born in 1615 into the Yorkshire aristocracy, but spent most of his childhood in Paris, which would have only consolidated his Catholicism. When he was 21 years old, he got married secretly to a wealthy heiress and got in trouble as a consequence, being fined 150 quid by the High Commission. The next significant bit of drama in John Bellasyse's life was his participation in the Bishops' Wars. John Bellasyse served in the King's Lifeguard during the Bishops' Wars. He became Member of Parliament for Thirsk, and then in 1642, the Civil War kicked off. As King Charles I was wandering around the country desperately arming up for the inevitable conflict, John Bellasyse was one of his attendants when the king arrived in York, and was also tasked with recruiting a cavalry regiment for the king. But John Bellasyse was a foot soldier, and when he saw his first taste of action in the Civil War at the Battle of Edge Hill, he was commanding an infantry regiment paid for by his father, Thomas Bellasyse. The Battle of Edge Hill took place in October 1642. In July the following year, John Bellasyse was fighting under the command of Prince Rupert of the Rhine in the southwest of England, in the incredibly bloody but ultimately successful assault on Bristol. John Bellasyse was wounded in the head. He had recovered sufficiently from his wounds to take part in the Battle of Newbury in September 1643. In that battle, John Bellasyse criticised a fellow soldier, a senior cavalry officer, Sir John Byron, gifted horse soldier, violent maniac, and brother of a former governor of Newark. Bellasyse criticised Byron for not sufficiently supporting his infantry during the battle. This wasn't that unusual. Officers on both sides of the conflict often feuded and criticised each other. But it was significant in that it foreshadowed the conflict to come with the third governor of Newark, Richard Willis, because Sir John Byron was one of Rupert's men, part of Rupert's faction. And, as we have already discovered, The conflict that would play out in Newark, that would result in John Bellasyse getting the governorship, was all about feuding and factions within the royalist ranks. But before any of that happened, in January 1644, John Bellasyse was made governor of York. Quite a promotion, but he had his work cut out for him. Now, the north of England was one of the epicentres of support for the king, but it was under attack. The attack came on two fronts. The Presbyterian Scots, also known as the Covenanters, Bellasyse's old enemies from the Bishops' Wars, had thrown in with Parliament and had invaded England from the north. But closer to home, the Roundhead super soldier and fellow Yorkshireman, Sir Thomas Fairfax, was launching attacks from Roundhead-occupied Hull, and he needed to be dealt with. The Scots weren't Bellasyse's problem. The Marquis of Newcastle, Charles Cavendish, the future husband of Mad Madge, whose life we've covered in another episode, was dispatched to deal with the Scots. Bellasyse's job was to deal with Fairfax. He didn't deal with Fairfax, although he gave it a good go. The Roundheads kicked the Cavaliers out of Bradford, and then Lord John Bellasyse tried to retake Bradford and failed, and then more Roundheads arrived from the Midlands, and then Selby fell to the Roundheads, and then Lord John Bellasyse was wounded again and captured on April the 11th, 1644. Bellasyse was locked up in the Tower of London, which I imagine was a reasonably miserable experience, but at the very least it stopped him from having to take part in the Battle of Marston Moor, in which a Cavalier army was routed. The king effectively lost the north, and his two former playmates, the Marquis of Newcastle and Prince Rupert of the Rhine, were roundly humiliated. If you were a rich prisoner in the Civil War, you didn't stay a prisoner for very long, because somebody on the other side would want to swap you for one of their rich prisoners. And that's what happened. And John Bellasyse went and hung out with the king for a bit. And despite the catastrophe of the north, seemed to get promoted quite a bit as well. He was made a baron, and then the commander of the King's Life Guard. And in October 1645, Lord John Bellasyse found himself in Newark with the king. And we all know what happened because we covered it in the first half of this podcast. But what we haven't got is John Bellasyse's version of events. But what we have got is John Bellasyse's version of events preserved in Samuel Pepys' diary. Samuel Pepys and Lord John Bellasyse appeared to be friends, or at least friendly enough for them to have dinner together. And it was during this dinner that Bellasyse recalled his memories of the argument between Rupert and the king. It would have been an anecdote that Samuel Pepys lapped up with glee, because he worked with the aged Rupert in naval administration, and their relationship was hostile, to say the least. So, here's what Bellasyse said, as recorded by Samuel Pepys. The king, having newly put out Prince Rupert of his generalship upon some miscarriage at Bristol, and Sir Richard Willis of his governorship of Newark at the entreaty of the gentry of the county, and put in Lord Bellasyse, the great officers of the king's army mutinied, and came in that manner with swords drawn into the marketplace of the town where the king was, which the king hearing says, I must to horse, and there himself personally, when everybody expected they would have been opposed, the king came and cried to the head of the mutineers, which was Prince Rupert, Nephew, I command you to be gone. So the prince, in all his fury and discontent, withdrew, and his company scattered, which they say was the greatest piece of mutiny in the world. With Richard Willis sacked and Rupert gone and the king gone, Sir John Bellasyse was left to govern Newark, as Newark faced its greatest test during the Civil War, the Third Siege of Newark. And it has to be said that Lord John Bellasyse did an excellent job. Prior to the siege, he improved Newark's siege defences considerably. And during the siege, his leadership held the town together as it was surrounded by the biggest army it had ever faced, in the form of a coalition of London, Midlands and Scottish Roundheads, and was subject to bombardment, starvation, the worst winter anybody could ever remember, and an outbreak of the plague, culminating in the capture of the king in neighbouring Southwell, which led directly to the surrender of Newark on the 8th of May 1646. All of these events have been covered in extensive detail in previous episodes of this podcast, but one of them deserves revisiting because, yet again, in the same dinner party, Lord John Bellasyse relayed an incident familiar to anybody who's listened to the Spy Story podcast. The king had been captured and sent a message by unorthodox means via an anonymous spy to John Bellasyse. This is Bellasyse's version of that event, again as relayed by Samuel Pepys. Among other at the table, he told us a very handsome passage of the king sending him his message about holding out the town of Newark, of which he was then governor for the king. This message he sent in a slug bullet being writ in cipher and wrapped up in lead and swallowed. So the messenger came to my lord and told him he had a message from the king, but it was yet in his belly. So they did give him some physic, and out it came. Out it came indeed. Like many defeated royalists after the First Civil War, Lord John Bellasyse left the country. There was a Second Civil War, the king was executed, and after that, Lord John Bellasyse was active in trying to get Charles II put back on the throne by force. In 1651, in what is come to be known as the Third Civil War, Charles II's plan was to invade England from Scotland with a largely royalist Scottish army. Royalist soldiers had been summoned in the north to support Charles as he marched into England and presumably reclaimed his throne. Lord John Bellasyse was supposed to lead these northern English royalists. He never got the chance. Word got out, and he was arrested and put back in the Tower of London, which was presumably quite miserable, but at least it spared him being at the Battle of Worcester, in which the Roundheads roundly slaughtered the Royalists, almost captured King Charles II, and effectively ended the civil wars there and then. John Bellasyse didn't stay in prison for very long. He was bailed out, and then became one of the founder members of the Sealed Knot, along with his old enemy, Richard Willis, and we all know how that turned out. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell died to absolutely no weeping and gnashing of teeth in the Royalist camp. His successor, Cromwell's son, Richard, was a cause for rejoicing amongst the Royalists because he was quite frankly rubbish at his job. He didn't last very long and resigned from his office. The resignation was cause for celebration amongst the Royalists because it provided another opportunity to take advantage of parliamentarian uncertainty and instability and organise another rebellion. This rebellion was called Booth's Rebellion, and like most Royalist rebellions, it was pretty badly organised. And the Sealed Knot, whose job, let us not forget, was to foment and encourage rebellion, actually tried to stop the rebellion before it happened because they saw it as a bit of a dead duck. They were right, the rebellion was a bit of a damp squib, but none of this stopped Lord John Bellasyse getting arrested anyway as a suspected co-conspirator and locked away. He wouldn't remain a prisoner for very long in this instance because a year later the political landscape had completely changed and King Charles II had been invited back to rule, and the period that we know as the restoration of the monarchy had begun. Now, the Restoration should have been a very bountiful time for Lord John Bellasyse, who, unlike Richard Willis, had a spotless record of loyal service to the king. He'd aligned himself with the correct factions and had served the king very, very well in victory and in defeat. Initially, things went very well. His service was rewarded with two peachy titles. He was made the Governor of Hull and the Lord Lieutenant of the East Riding. And between 1665 and 1666, he was the Governor of Tangier. But in 1667, personal tragedy would strike him when his son was involved in a violent incident. The incident, like everything it seems in Restoration England, was recorded in Samuel Pepys' diary. This is what he said. It happened that these two, the greatest friends in the world, were talking together, and Sir Henry Bellasyse talked a little louder than ordinary to Tom Porter, giving of him some advice. Some of the company standing by said, "What, are they quarrelling that they talk so high?" Sir Henry Bellasyse, hearing it, said, "No," says he, "I would have you know that I never quarrel, but I strike, and take that as a rule of mine." "How?" says Tom Porter. "Strike? I would I could see the man in England that durst give me a blow." With that, Sir Henry Bellasyse did give him a box of the ear. Tom Porter didn't take too kindly to being punched in the side of the head, even by a very good friend like Sir Henry Bellasyse. And Tom Porter did have form in matters of honour, having killed a soldier in a duel 2 years previously in Covent Garden. Consequently, he called his friend out, and the two men fought a duel with swords and both wounded each other. Pepys goes on to report about the two combatants that they are both ill. At the time of writing the diary entry, Pepys seemed unaware of the fact that Sir Henry Bellasyse had died of his wounds. Lord John Bellasyse's life was relatively quiet for the next decade or so. There was a little bit of a bump in the road that would foreshadow serious events to come, when a law was passed called the Test of Acts in 1673 that forced John Bellasyse to give up his titles. The reason for this was that he was a Catholic. Throughout the Civil War, despite being technically illegal to be a practicing Catholic, it hadn't been an issue. But now, in the height of the Restoration, paranoia about being a Catholic was starting to ferment and bubble up into something really quite ugly. A legal manifestation of that was the Test of Acts, which denied positions of power and influence to Catholics, and if Catholics already had them, took them away. The religious paranoia that this was an early symptom of culminated in the Popish plot of 1878, which John Bellasyse would be implicated in, really quite unfairly. The Popish plot was a Catholic conspiracy to murder King Charles II. Except the problem with the Popish plot was that it didn't exist. It was a phantom plot, largely invented and circulated by a man called Titus Oates, who must qualify as one of the most unpleasant figures in the entire Restoration period, who had been a Protestant naval chaplain who'd been kicked out of the Navy and then became a Catholic and was kicked out of not one but two Catholic universities, and then became embittered with Catholicism and came back to England with a mission to discredit Catholicism in any way he could. And Oates effectively started circulating stories about this plot, completely made up, but people believed him. Most alarmingly, the House of Commons believed him. And innocent Catholics were arrested and put on trial, and some of them were executed. And Lord John Bellasyse was arrested and sent, guess where? The Tower of London. I would imagine at this point he had his own cell and they just kept it waiting for him. Lord John Bellasyse was arrested and locked up in 1678, and he would remain in the Tower of London until 1684. In 1681, Titus Oates was discredited. He was arrested and he was put in prison and fined £100,000, but no one thought to let John Bellasyse out of prison. As I mentioned a few moments ago, he was eventually released in 1685, which happened to be the year that Charles II died, and was replaced by his brother James II, who was a Catholic. Lord John Bellasyse was completely exonerated in the eyes of the law, and he was given the positions of Privy Councillor and First Lord of the Treasury. Incidentally, James II ensured that Titus Oates was tried for a second time before the formidable hanging judge, Judge Jeffreys. Now, Judge Jeffreys didn't hang Titus Oates, but he did sentence him to be tied to the back of the cart and mercilessly beaten with a whip twice. And then he put him back in prison, and Titus Oates wouldn't get out of jail until William III was sitting on the throne of England. Good riddance to bad rubbish, that's what I say. And for once, Lord John Bellasyse was in a good, secure, unassailable position. He was on the right side with the right religion and a sympathetic monarch who'd given him some juicy and lucrative political positions. But he only had 4 years left with which to enjoy them. In September 1689, Lord John Bellasyse died in Witton in Middlesex. His memorial reads that he was Governor of Newark. He valiantly defended the garrison against the English and Scottish armies, till His Majesty came in person to the Scottish quarters and commanded the surrender of it. An honourable epitaph. I don't even think Sir Richard Willis would have a problem with that. Well, good people, that's all. This is the last episode of 17th Century Tales, recorded for the final time by me, Adam Nightingale, from a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. As always, the wonderful music was provided by Mark Nightingale, my brother. Heartfelt thanks also to my amazing colleagues in the National Civil War Centre Learning Team, Sarah, Denise and Donna. Thanks also to Genevieve, Kirsty and Sarah in marketing, without whose help these podcasts would not have been possible. Goodbye, stay safe and be civil to one another.